Today we're going to be discussing the career of the Empress Irene, who officially reigned from 797 until 802, but in point of fact was effectively the ruler of the Byzantine world from about 780 to 802, with a brief interruption between about 790 and 797. And Irene is a figure of great controversy, and the main claim to fame for Irene is that she is Byzantium's first and only reigning Basilissa, meaning female Basileus. So let's look at her life and explore exactly why she is such a figure of controversy. Let's look at Irene's origins and early life. Irene was a noble orphan from Athens born around the year 750. Her uncle or cousin, it's not really clear which, Constantine Sarantipicus, was a patrician and possibly also served as the strategos of the Hellosteme at the end of the 8th century. The reason and method of her selection as Leo's wife is not clear. Norwick thinks that it was because of her beauty, and he makes some sort of argument that Athens was no longer an intellectual hub, but again, Norwick sometimes just kind of shoots from the hip and makes things up as he goes, so let's not take that too seriously. Irene married the future Leo IV in late 768 and gave birth to the future Constantine VI in 771. One source of debate about Irene and her life is the degree to which she held influence over her husband Leo IV. So Irene was always an iconophile. She always wanted to end iconoclasm, but her husband and his family were the chief iconoclast of the empire. After all, it had been Leo IV's grandfather who had originally banned the icons, and Leo's father, Constantine V, was the chief thinker of the iconoclast movement. He was a great theologian in his own right. So, Irene definitely had an uphill battle. Now, when Leo IV took over in 775, he quickly ended some of his father's more extreme measures when it came to enforcing iconoclasm. He ended the outright persecution of iconodules and sort of returned to the policies of his grandfather, where his policies were against icons, not the people who worshipped icons. Many scholars have speculated that this was due to Irene's influence, and as evidence, they've cited her later control over her son, and also the fact that Leo IV was not a very healthy individual, and that he probably needed someone to lean on. However, I think that it's far too easy to assume that Irene controlled Leo IV, especially when we don't really have any evidence for this. We also know, for instance, that despite the fact that Leo IV was not a healthy individual, he was still an active man. He commanded troops in the field. So it's unlikely that he would have been someone who is weak enough to be manipulated to the extent that some scholars imagine. And also I think, and we'll get into this as we go along, that maybe the degree to which Irene is seen as a master manipulator gets blown out of proportion to reality once in a while. There's another story about that Leo IV decided to crack down on icon users in August of 780, and that he had turned against Irene and refused to share a bed with her, but then died in September. And because of that story, some scholars speculate that he had been under her influence and then had broken away, and then she had somehow had him murdered. Although we also know that he had had something like tuberculosis ever since he had taken office, and it's not really that surprising that he ended up dying while on campaign and exerting himself if he was sickly. When Leo IV died in September of 780, Irene was named as regent to her 9-year-old son, Constantine VI. The army in Asia Minor at this time was heavily iconoclast, and they had some interest in supporting one of Leo's 5 brothers, since they didn't feel comfortable with the idea of the empire being governed by a regent who was a woman. As an iconophile, Irene knew that she would have to move very cautiously, since she had very few allies within the army or the church, both of which were dominated by iconoclasts, which isn't surprising given that there had been 3 iconoclast emperors in a row. So since Irene couldn't just go forward and restore the icons, she decided to proceed with caution. From day one, Irene began to make slow progress toward removing iconoclasts and people who might potentially support one of her brothers-in-law, and she began to replace them with men who were personally loyal to her. And kudos to anyone who understands why Tom Perez is on this slide. In my previous video on Constantine VI, I refrained from talking about all of the things that happened under his reign when he wasn't actually exercising power, since all of those decisions were actually made by his mother, the regent Irene. So now let's talk about Irene's conduct as regent and look beyond just her role in dealing with the iconoclasm controversy. So, in 780, Irene faced her first crisis when Sicily revolted. In 780, she had appointed Elpidius to be the governor of Sicily, and then early the next year, Elpidius revolted and favored Leo's brother Nicephorus and tried to back him for the throne. So, in response, Irene then took Elpidius' wife and children hostage and tried to recall Elpidius to the capital. However, he refused, so then she upped the ante by having his family publicly whipped, and he still refused. So Irene had to send an expedition to get rid of Elpidius. She dispatched a fleet under the patrician Theodore, and he left in either late 781 or early 782, and he was able to win and defeat Elpidius after fighting several battles. Then Elpidius was still enough in command of the area to take the treasury and flee to Abbasid lands. And now he made a formal claim to the throne of Byzantium, and he would serve as an advisor to the caliphs as late as 802, which I think is the last time that he is attested. And I want to say he also took part in a couple of campaigns that occurred in Asia Minor when he accompanied some of the Abbasid armies. So Elpidius was dealt with, but he still posed a threat, and the Abbasids used him as something of a puppet and a tool. Not long afterward, another war between Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate broke out on the eastern frontier in Asia Minor when the caliph's son Harun al-Rashid crossed the eastern border with 100,000 men. At this time, the Armenian general Tatzades decided to defect with his entire army to the Abbasid side, which then left the Byzantines in a very precarious situation. So to deal with this problem, the hard-pressed Irene was forced to buy off Harun with an expensive truce, and then agreed to pay an annual tribute of 70,000 gold dinars for the next 3 years. For obvious reasons, this was something that did not settle well with most citizens of the empire, and it was viewed as a failure on her part. Whether fairly or unfairly is largely beside the point. In 783, Irene was in need of a victory, and her general Stauracius managed to deliver one for her. So that year, she dispatched her top supporter, the eunuch Stauracius, to Greece, and he was able to win the only great victory of Irene's entire reign. So Stauracius was able to put down the Slavs in Macedonia and Thessaly, and then make a deep raid into the still unsubdued Peloponnese, and return loaded down with plunder. This is also part of a very long process of the Byzantines reasserting their control of the Balkan Peninsula. They hadn't really controlled this area since the about middle of the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, and it would still be a while before Irene's successors were able to really bring the area under full authority of the Byzantine Empire again. But this is one of the many, many steps in that process. By 784, Irene now felt confident enough to push forward her own candidate for the Patriarch See and begin her campaign in earnest to restore the icons. So she decided to elect Tarasius to the Patriarch See, and that was a controversial decision. Tarasius was an imperial secretary, and he had never held an ecclesiastical office and was not even ordained. So Irene managed to push Tarasius through, and he was able to receive his ordination, and then after about a month or month and a half or something like that, he was then confirmed as the new patriarch. What this does is it sets a precedent for the politician versus zealot debate that occurred later, and that debate, to put it as simply as possible, was one of whether we should allow expediency in the service of good, or whether you should have to stick to the strict traditions and rules of the church no matter what. And this would be a huge dispute among monks and other ecclesiastical figures. And and like I said, it will take a little while to emerge, but definitely the irregular election of Tarasius will give a lot of inspiration to the people who will be known as the politician faction in later ages. As soon as Tarasius was confirmed as Patriarch, he and Irene began to prepare for a synod to restore icons. Tarasius planned very carefully, and he only invited delegates who were in favor of restoring the icons. The council that he called opened on August 17th of 786 in the Church of the Holy Apostles. However, this council was broken up by iconoclast soldiers, and this was especially troubling to the papal delegation, which had not anticipated this level of violence, and there was some danger that the papal delegation would not return for a second round. And now Tarasius and Irene are scrambling and trying to set up a second council so that they can get this done. It ended up taking Irene and Tarasius about 13 months to reconvene their council meeting. So, in order to get rid of the troops who had broken into the church and broken up the council, Irene decided to declare a new campaign in the east a few weeks after the council was broken up in 786, and as soon as the men were in the field, she had the guilty parties quietly disbanded and then replaced them with men who were more trustworthy from Bithynia, so men who presumably would not engage in mutinous behavior. When the delegates reconvened in September of 787, Irene took the additional precaution of having them meet in Nicaea at the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Nicaea was a smaller city and would be less prone to things like rioting, and it would also have a smaller garrison, so it would be less likely that you would have troops there who would mutiny or break up the meeting in the name of defending iconoclasm. Now, just like the first time, this was a council where the outcome was basically predetermined. There was no debate on the issue of iconoclasm, only how to deal with iconoclast. And ultimately, this decision came down as follows. The idea was that iconoclast bishops would be allowed to keep their sees so long as they released a public recantation, and that really infuriated the monastic faction, which was calling for their excommunication. If you'll recall, the monks were instrumental in saving a lot of icons from destruction, and they had a visceral hatred of the iconoclast faction. So, they were upset by this decision, but as you might imagine, the will of the bishops was a great deal more important than the will of the monks when it came to any kind of formal church council. So, not surprisingly, the bishops got their way, and they moved forward with a more conciliatory policy that would be less likely to cause problems, and the monks, who were really zealous, were sort of left in the lurch a bit. Having restored the icons, Irene was riding high, and she decided to engage in more high-handed action, this time at the expense of her son, the Emperor Constantine VI. So back in 781, Irene had arranged for Constantine to become engaged to Rotrud, and she had even dispatched Greek instructors to teach the Frankish princess the proper language of the Eastern Empire. However, for reasons that are unknown, Irene ended the engagement in 787. That same year, she decided to hold a bride show for her son, and it seems like she selected Maria of Amnia to become Constantine's new wife. Now, Constantine VI, by this point, was nearing adulthood, and he was not pleased by the cancellation of his betrothal to Rotrud and his mother's domineering intervention in his personal life. And this seems to have been the start of the troubles between them, which would later blossom into things that we'll talk about. Of more immediate consequence than the growing rift between mother and son, however, was the reaction of Charlemagne, who was at this point the most powerful man in Europe. Charlemagne was understandably upset with Irene's rash decision to break off the engagement between Constantine and Rotrud, and in 788 Charlemagne attacked Byzantine holdings in Italy. Several key cities fell to the Franks, and it was a pretty big setback for Byzantine interest in Italy. Rotrud never went on to marry anyone else after her betrothal was broken off, and this is actually in keeping with what happened to her sisters as well. Charlemagne did not allow his daughters to officially marry or have legitimate children because he already had 4 legitimate sons, and the birth of any cadet branches of the family would most likely lead to more civil wars and require that the empire be divided into yet more parts. It was still Frankish tradition to divide the empire between the living sons of a monarch, and Charlemagne knew that the more sons and legitimate heirs that he produced, the more fragmented his legacy would become. So he tried to limit that by preventing his daughters from marrying. So if you're wondering why Rotrud never had any children and what happened to her, this is what happened. She did probably have an unofficial husband and seemed to have some unofficial kids. Charlemagne was apparently very fond of his illegitimate grandchildren, but at any rate, that's a different story for a different day. Speaking of family matters, Irene's relationship with Constantine would now reach a breaking point. By 790, the 19-year-old Constantine VI was ready to rule in his own name, and most of the time it was customary for a regent to step aside when a young emperor was about 16 to 18, and then let that emperor rule in his own name. So Constantine VI was due to take over, and he was presumably growing pretty restless with his mother's continued dominance. It also must have embarrassed him due to the norms of a society that was completely male-dominated. But Irene decided to move in the exact opposite direction from what most people would have expected. She actually decreed that she should take precedence over Constantine as the senior ruler and that her name should appear first on decrees. Well, Constantine VI was not pleased by that, and neither were the people who now supported him and wanted to get rid of Irene. As you might imagine, the main people who were pissed off at Irene were the iconoclasts, who still saw her restoration of the icons as a kind of sleazy, fly-by-night council which wasn't legitimate because of the way that it had been handled and the lack of an actual debate over the merits of icons. So, Constantine VI was at the head of this conspiracy to depose his mother, and most of his supporters were iconoclast, and their aim was actually to banish Irene to Sicily. And I suppose there's a certain amount of irony there, since Sicily had revolted against Irene early on during her regency, and maybe this was seen as a subtle form of punishment and insult. At any rate, though, Irene was quick to the draw, and she detected the plot, and had her son jailed, and then she demanded an oath of loyalty to herself from her son and all of his followers. However, this didn't end up solving the problem, as it turns out that Constantine VI actually had more political support than his mother due to his membership in the Isaurian dynasty. By trying to become the senior ruler at the expense of her son, who was the rightful holder of the throne, and by trying to extract an oath of loyalty, Irene had badly overreached, and the army of Asia Minor, which was heavily iconoclast, moved into Constantinople and restored Constantine VI as the sole ruler of the empire. At this time, Irene was confined to her palace at Eleutherius, which I believe was a new place that she had built herself, and she was more or less under house arrest from 790 to 792, and during that time she was deprived of her title of Basilissa. And by any reasonable expectations, this should have been the end of her career. Most of the time, when a female regent steps aside and an adult, healthy son takes power, we don't really hear all that much from the mother after that point. However, Irene was not your typical female regent, and she would be back, and she would be back very forcefully in the near future. When he first overthrew his mother in 790, Constantine VI was very popular, and people were hopeful for the future. Here was a young emperor now back in control. He had dealt with the irregularity that his mother had attempted, and now things would get back to normal, and Byzantium would have a strong male ruler. Well, not quite. So as soon as he took power, it was pretty clear that Constantine VI was not a very talented ruler. In just 2 short years, he managed to suffer 2 military reverses on both major fronts against the Arabs in the east and then the Bulgars in the west, and his prestige was running dangerously low. So his response was to look for potential allies. And since he was sort of playing a dangerous game when it came to courting iconoclast and iconophiles, he decided to appeal to the monastic faction by playing to his mother. Now, his mother was someone who was very popular with the monks, and Constantine restored her position and title in 792, and he thought that thereby he would gain an ally and get the monks off his back. However, in the event, it also alienated the iconoclast who had supported him in the first place, as they did not want Irene anywhere near power and they felt betrayed. So while it sort of made sense at first, it really alienated his key support base, and it was actually a pretty inept move to restore his mother to power. It was very clear from the evidence that during the 5-year period from 792 to 797 that Constantine VI is very much still in the driver's seat as the senior imperial actor, and that his mother was at best the junior ruler and possibly even just a counselor, and not really someone who was actually exercising authority in an open or direct way. Over the 5-year period from 792 to 797, Constantine VI continued to make moves, almost all of which undermined his popularity, and the one thing that really stands out is when he behaved with excessive cruelty toward his 4 uncles, and then engaged in the Medicean controversy where he divorced his wife Marie of Amnia and remarried, which under church law at the time constituted adultery. And in terms of this act of cruelty towards his uncles, he had one uncle try to revolt, and in response he had taken 4 uncles who were uninvolved and had their tongues ripped out. And this made him look disloyal since those uncles had never caused him any grievance before that point. So, because of Constantine's failure and how things ended up turning out between mother and son, some scholars have tried to view Irene as a Machiavellian advisor who deliberately steered her son toward doom so that she could seize power for herself. And we do know that she was loved by the monastic faction and that she would engage in intrigue if it helped her. But if she did undermine her son, then that was probably something that she only started to do late during that 5-year period, after it became clear that his days were numbered. I don't think that she had some sort of grand plot from the very beginning to undermine Constantine. I think that she was just happy to probably be restored in any capacity at all, and then as it became clear that her son was a complete failure, she decided to abandon him and go her own way, and then try to fulfill her old ambition of ruling in her own name. So that's sort of my take on it, but it's kind of hard to know since the evidence is a little unclear, and of course these sources are deeply biased against Irene since she's an ambitious woman in the Middle Ages. Up to this point, if you weren't familiar with Irene's story before watching this video, you're probably wondering why she's one of the most infamous figures in Byzantine history. Well, now that mystery is about to be resolved. So, in 797, Constantine VI took the field against Caliph Harun al-Rashid. He had succeeded his father, but for whatever reason, Constantine VI had retired to the capital before the Caliph had left Byzantine territory, and that made him look really cowardly, and it completely undermined whatever credibility he had left. So then in June of 797, Irene's men ambushed Constantine while he was riding through the streets of Constantinople, and he was able to flee to the east, and he was trying to gather his forces, but then he was captured before he could really gather anyone to support him. The captured Constantine was formally deposed and then blinded in August, and that left Irene as the sole holder of imperial authority. So the fact that she overthrew and blinded her son is why Irene is such a controversial and infamous figure in Byzantine history. So now that we've established the facts of how Irene deposed her son Constantine, let's look into some possible explanations for why she did what she did. Well, we know for starters that she was clearly power-hungry and ambitious. She had tried to claim the title of senior emperor over her own son, despite the fact that no mother had ever been able to do that, and that she was not the daughter of a previous ruler, but rather a daughter-in-law. So, it was kind of a weird step for her to take, and it is only really explicable if you look at her as being ambitious beyond what we've seen in the past. It's also possible, and if we look at the evidence, it's clear that her son was pretty incompetent, that she saw her son as unfit for the throne and believed that she was acting in the best interest of the empire by removing her son from power and replacing him with herself. She may have legitimately believed that she was a more fit ruler than Constantine. However, as we'll see, I don't know if she's really that much better. So maybe she did have that mistaken belief, however, since there are a lot of parents who do believe that their kids are a lot worse than they actually are, and they just have a general sense of disappointment with their children, even when it's not quite justified. But at any rate, what we can say is that in ancient and medieval texts, there's always a deep suspicion of any woman who has an ambition for power, and that's really the main reason why there's such a heavy bias against her and a tendency to assume the absolute worst about her. And because that bias is present, that's why so many modern accounts of Byzantine history make Irene out to be the real boogeyman. While it's possible that she just did this in the name of power and she didn't really care about the morality of the act, I think that in her own mind she probably had some reason for doing what she did, even if that reason was not very well thought out or wouldn't really make sense to anyone else. So that's sort of my thought on the overthrow of Constantine. So let's make a quick side note about terminology. So sometimes people report that Irene held the title of Basileus, which is the male-gendered word for emperor. However, in point of fact, she used the title Basilissa, which is the female version. There are only 3 coins that call Irene the Basileus, and because those 3 coins are so rare, it's possible it was just merely a misprint at one of the mints. The title that she really used the most, as I mentioned, was Basilissa. And I would also like to point out to any pedants out there that the reality of her power was the same either way. So let's not focus too much on something that is kind of just a trivial side note. Moving on. When she became sole ruler in 797, Irene found herself in a precarious position, and it's really amazing that she managed to last 5 years given how weak her position truly was. So first of all, Constantine's deposition was incredibly unpopular, and the army of Asia Minor came very close to mutinying in favor of their now blind favorite. Remember, the army of Asia Minor was still deeply iconoclast and had supported the Isaurian dynasty since the days of Leo III, all the way back starting in 717. So for them to support Constantine VI despite his ineptitude was not all that surprising, since that is the kind of thing they had been doing for 80 years at this point. As for Irene herself, when dealing with foreign policy, she was also seen as vulnerable by the Abbasids. So, in order to keep the Abbasids at bay, Irene decided to pay a larger tribute than the one that her son had already agreed to, following his beating at the hands of the Abbasids. And this was just to avoid another conflict in the east that she didn't think she could win. So if you are a member of the Byzantine army, you probably look at this as a slap in the face, since you hadn't been defeated again, but yet your ruler was now increasing the tribute to a foreign power that you hadn't had a chance to defeat in several years. However, Irene's strategy was to appease the wealthy elite and hope for the best. So she tried to appeal to all of the major players in the Byzantine state with large tax remissions of all kinds, including ending the tax on receipts, which was unpopular, and ending the municipal levy of Constantinople altogether. She also halved the vital customs duties that were collected at ports. So this was a way to keep people happy enough that they didn't want to overthrow her. After all, they stood to gain in their personal financial situation from having her on the throne, even if they thought that she was a horrible person and a completely incompetent ruler. However, as you might imagine, this was not really a sustainable situation, and things would deteriorate from here. Despite the fact that Irene was able to rule for 5 years, she was never able to rule effectively. So let's look at the reasons why she wasn't able to be an effective ruler. First of all, she had 2 main supporters, the eunuchs Stauracius and Aetius, but these 2 individuals were constantly at odds with one another, and that really held back the coherency of Irene's government. At the same time, the army was horrified and humiliated by the tribute that she was paying to the Abbasids, and because of the size of that payment and her massive tax breaks for the rich, they were worried that they wouldn't be able to get paid. Remember, in the ancient and medieval worlds, finances are very literal and direct. There's no such thing as deficit spending or printing out more money or anything like that. You either have money or you don't. And if you don't have money, then people don't get paid. The civil service, for obvious reasons, was also alarmed by her fiscal policies. They were expected to keep the state running, but to do so on a shoestring budget, and they were really not happy about it. This is all compounded by the fact that there were already existing sexist assumptions about women not being able to rule, about not being strong enough to rule, and this all must have seemed to be confirmed by the fact that Irene was failing horribly, and her only, way to keep on the power was just to kowtow to the elite and give them handouts over and over. That was all she had going for her at that point. So she appeared incredibly weak and vulnerable. And you can imagine if you're an ambitious aristocrat and you, say, have a family lineage that's pretty strong, you're probably thinking, hey, now might be my time to establish a dynasty. The Isaurians are on their way out. Also, speaking of that, she had no grandchildren to take up the reins of government. Constantine VI had been an only child, so there's not a cadet line there that she can serve as regent for. And Constantine's own children had died young. So there was no future, and she was a woman already in her 50s at this point. So she really didn't have much of a leg to stand on here. Most likely, the only reason why her reign lasted 5 years is because elite citizens were able to reap personal benefits from these massive tax cuts. There's really no other way to explain why people, especially ambitious aristocrats, just allowed this to go on for 5 years without stepping up and trying to seize power. They must just have wanted to make some bank. Irene's reign continued slowly and painfully, and in 800 she received a potential lifeline. That year, Charlemagne was crowned as Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, and he decided that he wanted to have his title reach full legitimacy. And to achieve that, he needed recognition from Constantinople, the recognized center of the Roman world, and all that is Roman in the proper sense. So, he proposed that he and Irene should marry each other and thereby unite the Roman world. And he knew that despite her earlier objections to siding with a Western barbarian, at this point she's in dire straits, and she will look to any source of salvation that she can find, even if it is a barbarian. So, Irene seems to have carefully considered this offer, and it looks like she may have even been in favor of taking it, except that, she fell from power before she was able to come to a final decision, because rumors got out about her considering this offer, and the Byzantine aristocracy was not willing to brook an insult that great from Irene. They had had their fill, and they had also gotten rich off of her, so they decided to cut their losses and call it a day. So let's look at exactly why the Byzantines were so upset by this marriage proposal and why this was the straw that broke the camel's back. So by 802, Irene was dangerously unpopular, and the empire had been struggling for 5 years now under her rule, and it didn't look like things were going to get any better. So aside from the very rich who were making a lot of money by not having to pay taxes, everyone else was tired of this, and even they were beginning to grow concerned about the empire's setbacks on its frontiers and the growing weakness of the state. The real problem with the marriage proposal that Charlemagne put forward, however, is that, as Byzantine elites knew, Frankish Salic law prohibited female rule. So that meant that if she married Charlemagne, then he would rule the empire and not her. She would not be able to retain her independent role as the ruler at Constantinople. So that would put them under the rule of a foreign barbarian emperor, who none of them recognized as being Roman, despite the Pope crowning him emperor of the Romans. So this meant that the Byzantine aristocracy would finally jump into action and move against Irene. Irene's logothete, her finance minister Nicephorus, organized a coup, and he assumed power on October 31st, 802. This is his coin on the left. Irene was exiled to Lesbos, and then she died the next year in 803. So much for Irene. Now let's look at her legacy. So, what is Irene's legacy? Well, first of all, she is almost certainly the most controversial Byzantine ruler, and if she's not the most controversial, then she's a close second to Justinian II. So, she's got that going for her, or against her, depending on how you look at it. Her rule also happened to coincide with Charlemagne's rule, and that means that Byzantium missed out on a lot of potential opportunities to work with the Franks or to work against them in order to assert their own Roman uniqueness. Because the Franks were able to really penetrate the Roman legacy to some extent at the expense of the Byzantines because of the failures of Irene and the successes of Charlemagne. So say, had Irene allowed the marriage of Constantine and Rotrud to come to fruition, the two empires might have worked together, she might not have lost as much land in Italy, and the Byzantines would have been in a better position to capitalize on the division of the Frankish world after Charlemagne's eventual death. So it's possible that the Byzantines could have gained quite a bit by working more carefully with the Franks, and for whatever reason, Irene squandered that opportunity, and I feel like a more capable ruler would have been better able to deal with that. Her overthrow and blinding of her own son also doomed the Isaurian line to extinction. By the time he was blinded and deposed, Constantine's child had died, but he was still a young man, and he could have, fathered another child, and then that child could have gone on to keep the Isaurian line going, and perhaps either through Constantine or even his mother Irene, that child could have been raised and then taken power. By the time a child born at that time would have come of age, by that point Irene would be too old to keep ruling, and old age would outstrip her ambition, and maybe then she could step down with dignity and allow the line to go on. But that, of course, never happened because of when she overthrew her son and the fact that there was no one to replace him or to replace her once she died. Another legacy that Irene has going for her is that she is one of the most famous female monarchs in history. And if you look at any kind of list of, women rulers throughout history, her name will be likely to appear, although usually not for the best of reasons. At any rate, though, that's all I've got to say about Irene, and next time we'll take a look at the equally controversial, or not equally controversial, but also controversial career of Nicephorus I.